Everyone hates on Harry Potter, but it's still one of the greatest fantasy series of all time.
I haven't read it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Classics are dull and boring. By the time Sanderson is retired, the Cosmere will be the greatest fantasy series ever written. Unpopular opinions. You guys seem to love the series, and I've had so many brilliant guests on here like Patrick Leo, Mike's Book Review, Bookborn, and today I'm honored to not have only one guest, but two guests, Tori Talks and Johanna. Both of the booktubers that started the trend, Epic Fantasy is dying. They are the reason we're having this conversation. No, I'm obviously joking here. Obviously, people are, I've kind of been blowing that out, but it's so good to have both of you. I love both of these channels. I'll put the links in the description down below if you want to check them out. And as always, we have signs to say agree or disagree. So as I show and read the unpopular opinions, we'll highlight the signs and we'll have a discussion. But first, as I do with all my guests, I would love to hear if you have any unpopular opinions. So Tori, do you have an unpopular opinion you would like to share with us?
I have quite a few unpopular opinions, but the one that I'm going to share right now is that I think as a whole, the fantasy community is way too forgiving with how sexual violence is portrayed in fantasy novels.
That is an interesting one. I feel like I could make a whole video about that one, but we'll leave it there. Johanna, do you have an unpopular opinion?
So my unpopular opinion, and I have to shout out this one because I have my great Malazan friend in the chat, Tori. I have the very unpopular opinion of preferring Malazan Book of the Fallen, Book 1 over Book 2. So I preferred my reading experience of Gardens of the Moon over my reading experience of Dead House Gate. That could change upon reread or later, but for now, that is what it is.
Yeah, it's definitely a good opinion. I think generally people think Gardens of the Moon is probably the weakest book in the series. Or definitely
a lot of people think that, and Dead
do.
House Gates does have an iconic ending, but I did overall, book experience-wise, enjoyment-wise, find myself connect more to Book 1.
We could still be friends.
That was the test of this video.
Right.
Excellent. Well, without further ado, let's get into your guys' unpopular opinions. Everyone hates on Harry Potter, but it's still one of the greatest fantasy series of all time. Okay, I'll can start first. I'll say disagree when it talks about one of the greatest fantasy series of all time, but when it comes to cultural impact, it might be. Maybe Lord of the Rings is also, obviously up there, but at least in recent times, I think cultural impact, Harry Potter is definitely up there of one of the greatest fantasy series of all time. And I also have and I'm not sure if it's an unpopular opinion today, but I also think it's okay to love the series still.
I would agree with that distinction too about having like the cultural impact that Harry Potter had on a huge generation, multiple generations of readers, and kind of gatewaying them into bigger fantasy series is awesome. But if you're just going by greatest fantasy series of all time, I would definitely disagree with that.
Yeah, and it's also how you're defining great, and whether great equals popular, getting more people into the genre, what kind of metric you're using here. I think if I saw Harry Potter on somebody's top 10 fantasy series of all time, I would be fine with that. I could 100%. Understand it having a place in somebody's journey, being an important part of their journey. For me, it's probably not the greatest, but I still enjoyed it.
I haven't read it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I've read the first book.
Song of Ice and Fire is overrated. I don't really feel like I can have a strong opinion here because I actually haven't watched the show and I've only read the first two books, which I did enjoy, but I read the first two books before I actually started reading, like when I was way too young. So I think if I read them now, they would probably become one of my all-time favorite series. But I think both of you have read the 5 books. At least I know Johanna has. So I'll allow you to comment on this one.
Sure. Well, I read the 5 books twice. I think that it was very important for me as a fantasy reader. When I read them about 12 years ago, it was the first time I'd ever read an epic fantasy series where I saw really nuanced, interesting female representation. And I fell in love with that world, with the settings, with the characters, of course, with the dragons, with the magic, with so many elements. And there's so many things upon reread that I feel like George R.R. Martin did better than most other fantasy readers I've read from, at least at this point. And of course, there's a lot of other fantasy I still need to read, but
Yeah.
I still think A Song of Ice and Fire is amazing. It's incredible.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I read it a long time ago when I had kind of first started getting into epic fantasy, and similar to you, Johanna, Brienne of Tarth was a game-changing character for me because I felt like I could relate to her so much more than so many of the other female characters I'd ever seen in fantasy. And like you said, just the spectrum of that was so awesome. And just in general, I do think that he is a very good, if not sadistic, character writer. But yeah, I definitely think, I mean, it's just there you can't argue with the scope and the impact that series has had, and I think it's well deserved for the most part.
I think often when we look at fantasy series and also epic fantasy series, one thing that is very, very important and has a big impact is an ending. And I'm wondering if this user is thinking they read the first 5 books and there's no ending, and therefore the series feels underrated because they haven't had that emotional impact of actually finishing it.
I probably have an unpopular opinion about that, actually, which is that like one of my favorite authors and series is Gentlemen Bastards by Scott Lynch. And I'm at the point where I'm like, if he writes another book in the series, I will be thrilled. Everything will stop and I will read it immediately. But I had such an amazing experience with the books that are already out that like, whether it continues or not, nothing can take away the experience I've already had.
Lord of the Rings doesn't need to be on your top 10 lists. We have more series now. Okay, I agree with this one, but I think when people do not appreciate what Tolkien has done for the genre, that's something different. But yeah, I don't really think that like if you don't enjoy Lord of the Rings, you don't need to love it and you don't need to fake it. So when I do my top 10 list, I generally put Lord of the Rings in my honorable mentions now, just because I find it so predictable that everyone expects Lord of the Rings to be on number 1. Yeah, I still think it's one of the greatest fantasy series of all time. But yeah, it doesn't need to be in your top 10.
Yeah, I would agree with that. For me, it's definitely one of my favorite series of all time. But at the same time, I can totally understand if it doesn't make somebody's top 10 list, if they gravitate towards other types of fantasy, that's totally understandable.
And I think it goes back a little bit to the question of gatekeeping, where it's like if somebody's coming into the genre and they have all these favorites and there's kind of this unspoken like canon of series that if you haven't read them or you don't have them on your top 10, are you actually a fantasy fan? You know, and obviously not. And like I have not actually read, again, The Lord of the Rings. So
wow.
I'm not a real fantasy fan.
No, you are definitely not a fantasy reader.
Yeah, right. Johan kicks me off the stream. Yeah, so like you said, the impact that it's had and that Tolkien really just did so much for our genre, which is amazing. But if it's not on your top 10 list, that's okay.
Classics are dull and boring.
Classics in general, classic fantasy.
Oh, I'm not sure. This person hasn't specified.
I'm gonna be weird about this one. I think oftentimes classics get a free pass because they're classics, and if somebody wants to say no, this is a horrible book, people are like, but it's a classic, so it can't it can't be. So yeah, some classics are dull and boring. However, I disagree that all of them are, and I think there are some incredible classics that still have a lot of very important things to say and can be read and really well enjoyed.
I think that's really well said, Tori, because I know for myself, I mean, whether somebody thinks something is dull and boring, that's very subjective, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, I did read a classic earlier this year. I read Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, and I found the experience very dull and boring. I appreciated what the book achieved, and I enjoyed discussing it afterwards, but I did not enjoy my reading experience of that book. At the same time, the majority of classics I've read, I've found thoroughly entertaining and interesting, but of course there's always going to be some that are going to miss the mark for some of us.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with both of you on this. I definitely agree with you, Tori, that like a lot of classics kind of get a free pass.
Yeah.
The reason why I would disagree, like one of my all-time favorite books, 1984, is a classic. But what I would never do is to recommend a classic to someone that wants to get into reading. And so many people, when they say, oh, I want to read, they look at like the top 10, best books of all time. And they're all of these books that were written like 100 years ago. And I'm just thinking like that is a horrible start point to fall in love with reading for at least most readers. I don't want to generalize here, but I just know in my experience that I read a lot of classics before I really got into reading. And then I picked up Mistborn, And that, that just blew my mind away because the writing was so accessible, and it was just something different. So classics are definitely something I respect highly, and I love a lot of the classics. But yeah, some are dull and boring, and occasionally it feels like they're only recognized in circles because of their historic impact they've had on something.
Right.
That's a good point, because especially if somebody's coming into reading, if you're somebody who's read a lot of classics, you might have a different mindset towards classics than somebody who's just trying to get into reading for the first time, as you said. Because right away, I have to say that du Maurier's Rebecca is a classic that I would recommend to just about anyone. I think that it's a fantastic, very entertaining book. I think it's aged incredibly well, in my opinion. So that's one that I think could be read by a wide audience.
We're more likely to get endless A Song of Ice and Fire spin-off shows than new adaptations like Cosmere and First Law and so on. Ooh.
I would agree with this, and I feel it's kind of too bad. As much as I love A Song of Ice and Fire and I'm all for more from that world, I think it's kind of sad that we're not getting other types of fantasy adaptations. I think that's one thing that a lot of us fantasy readers feel a little disappointed about. But what do you all think about that?
Definitely. We've seen they're redoing Twilight, they're redoing Harry Potter, we're doing more Song of Ice and Fire. And I read books every year that I think, wow, this would be such an incredible visual media piece. And it's never going to happen. So I do feel like there's a lot of recycling of ideas that I wish would be a little bit less prevalent.
Yeah, I made a video around a year ago where I talked about the new Harry Potter reboot and how actually that was a bad thing for fantasy as a whole. Because I was just thinking, if there's so many incredible series out there that has sold millions of books, but HBO has decided to reboot a series that already has generally really good movies. It's not like the movies are bad by any stretch, Yeah, it's quite sad if I'm being absolutely honest, but I kind of get it because a lot of these new series don't have any brand recognition. But yeah, it feels like we'll definitely have more A Song of Ice and Fire spin-off shows before we get Cosmere. But I'm pretty confident we will have a Cosmere movie or TV show one day, but we might have to wait another 5 or 10 years. I don't know. I don't get the hype for super violent fantasy. More PG-13 fantasy like John Gwynne, please. This kind of relates to your opinion, doesn't it, Tori?
Well, yes-ish. It does. Like, I'm not opposed to content like that being in the books because I think it is important to have conversations around it. I do think that oftentimes it is the authors lean into more the shock value or the gratuitous kind of nature of those scenes, as opposed to being more responsible with, okay, this is I need to handle this in a very serious, figure out how to, But yeah, I would say I'm a military fantasy nerd. So this particular thing, I'm kind of both sides of the fence because I don't mind super violent fantasy, which probably says something about me, but also I think it's incredibly important to have a spectrum because there are readers with all sorts of different tastes and interests, and a lot of people don't want to this person read R+ rated fantasy, and that's important for there to be really well done series for them, and especially for the rest of the community, not to bring them down for it, because I have seen that before where people are like, well, you just can't handle it, and they kind of degrade if you can't handle this level of violence in your fantasy, go somewhere else kind of mindset. And I think that needs to be absolutely cut out.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. As for myself, I'm somebody who's really enjoying our Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse series, which is probably the most violent in fantasy, or at least the most violent that I know of and that I've read. And as much as I've gushed about that series because I've enjoyed my experience so much, well, enjoy always feels like the wrong word when it comes to Baker, but I've been so fascinated by that series. If you hear me talk about it, most of the time I'm not saying, wow, I enjoyed all that sexual violence and all of that gory death.
Right.
That's usually not all well written. I don't think that those particular scenes are necessarily what I gravitate towards as a reader. That's not necessarily what's been pulling me into the series. So if somebody used gratuitous violence or a lot of shock value as clickbait to get me to, as a reader, to buy into a series, that's not going to work for me personally. There has to be so much more going for it, and that violence has to have a role in the narrative, like an important integral role, and not necessarily to get people excited. So I think that this is kind of a nuanced conversation.
Yeah, definitely. That's also why I'm somewhere in the middle, and I agree with you about having this spectrum. I mean, if an author goes out to write a story about a torturer, someone that's absolutely vile and malicious, but doesn't include any scenes that are super violent, then like that just doesn't make any sense when it comes to the story, right? But that doesn't mean that you have to write books that are super violent. Obviously, Lord of the Rings and other series, we don't have those scenes that are super violent, and they're still incredible. But yeah, I think it all comes down to intent. Like, why do you include these scenes? Do they have a purpose? And I've DNF'd a couple of books where I just felt like they were super violent, and I didn't really understand the purpose of writing so many pages of people being tortured and slaughtered and mutilated and so on and so on. So I kind of do understand this person when he says I don't get the hype for super violent fantasy, but I do also think it can have its place, and it definitely should be included as well in the fantasy sphere. By the time Sanderson is retired, the Cosmere will be the greatest fantasy series ever written. Yeah, I'm also kind of in a disagree here. I think it might be, and it's maybe a bit of a far stretch, but it might be on a similar level to Harry Potter when it comes to cultural impact. I do see the series, it can become the next MCU or whatever. I'm not saying it's gonna be, but it can be. But when it comes to like literary works and style and so on, there's many other series out there I read that have had a big impact on me emotionally, and also I just think are greater. But yeah, I do think there is a path for it to become this incredible cultural thing.
I mean, I agree with that in the sense that Sanderson has brought so many new readers to fantasy, and that is something that I think is amazing, and I love that. And I've read a lot of his work. I've enjoyed a lot of his work. But yeah, similar to you, it's like I've read so much at this point within the genre that I wouldn't put the Cosmere, and I have very unpopular opinions about the Cosmere, so take that with a grain of salt. but yeah, I mean, it will be a great fantasy series, but I'll give it that.
Before Johanna, I come over to you, it might also have an impact that I finished Edge Dancer yesterday, which at the moment I think it might be the worst thing I read in the Cosmere as of now. So I read it yesterday and I was like, what was the point of this? So I do appreciate that this might have had an impact. But yeah, I love Sanderson. I have all of his leather browns here. So I'm not saying I am not a fanboy. I'm definitely a big fanboy, but I'm not sure if it's going to be the greatest.
It will not be for me personally. I'll just say that. I did enjoy my time reading what Sanderson I've read. Actually, I didn't enjoy Edge Dancer either.
I didn't either.
I'll go ahead and be honest. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm curious about what's going to happen with that series. Of course, it's going to be the Stormlight Archive is going to be a 10-book series, and we'll see.
The Way of Kings is 500 pages too long. I will say disagree here, but it might be 150 pages too long. Maybe. The start of that book is very, very slow, but yeah, I don't know. For me, that book is incredible. So yeah, I think primarily I definitely disagree with this one.
Yeah, my unpopular opinion about Stormlight Archive is that The Way of Kings was my favorite book in the series. Wow. I could see a case for why people love Words of Radiance more, but I actually loved the books in order. So I loved Way of Kings the most, followed by Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, and then Rhythm of War was my least favorite. Yeah,
I wouldn't say that with Way of Kings or Words of Radiance, but those are the only two Stormlight Archive books I liked. So I would say that for the last two.
Yeah, I recently finished Oathbringer, and I did enjoy that book as a whole, but that book probably was 200-300 pages too long. I just felt there's so many pages in that book where I don't feel they added much to the plot. So I'm slightly worried now, having read Oathbringer, which I thought was okay, and Edge Dancer, which I didn't like, and now like Rhythm of War is next up. And yeah, most people, almost everyone says that's the weakest Stormlight Archive book, so I'm quite worried.
Yeah, that was my least favorite, Rhythm of War.
Yep, I think it's my least favorite. Well, no, never mind. I was going to say it's my least favorite Sanderson book, but I think there's one that I would put underneath it, so we're good.
Oh, wow.
Do you want to share which one that is?
Yeah, which one?
Well, so I started his Steelheart series. and I really didn't like that one. And then Cytonic I thought was really awful. So
Okay. Fortunately, those are not in the Cosmere. So.
no,
That's
no.
true.
Still Sanderson work though.
I hate lending out my books. Others never take care of them the way I do. I'm guessing that person is probably going to say.
Well, yeah.
I haven't really had a lot of experience lending out my books in recent times, so I don't know that I could weigh in on this, but I guess I have in the past. There have been cases where I've lent out my book and gotten them back with the spines broken, and I was really upset about that. So if that were the case, I would not lend out my books. But if it were from somebody that I trust not to do that, then I would be totally fine.
Yeah, I've lost a couple of my books, just never came back. Yeah, like you, Johanna. If it's somebody I know that's also another like book nerd, or somebody that I know is going to take good care of it. It also depends on which book. That
Very
definitely
true.
makes a big difference.
I have quite a lot of like secondhand paperback books I paid like £1 for. I don't really care if that book gets damaged because generally those books are in a horrible state anyway. But yeah, I would never borrow some of the books behind me out because yeah, it would just be way too big of a risk. So I kind of can relate to this person. If there was never an adaptation of my favorites, I would be totally fine. I do not care. That's what Bookborn says. This kind of relates to what Johanna said earlier. Ooh, I'm somewhere actually in the middle, but I agree. But I'm happy for you, Tori, to go first.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if I'm talking about my favorites, I would love to see an adaptation of Red Rising at some point. That being said, I also know that's a huge risk. So would I rather not have one at all or have a horrible adaptation? I would rather not have one at all, hands down.
I am so indifferent about this. I if my favorite series were all adapted, I don't know that I would watch them, to be honest. I'd be happy. I'd be happy if it brought more people to the fandom, and I wouldn't really care if directors made whatever choices they made. I just know I have the books, so I guess I'm fine either way.
I think the great things about adaptations is that it's a way to get people that would never read your favorite books, to actually experience the book in some kind of way. I know it's not the same anyway, but at least they kind of understand what is the thing that you love or are so passionate about. But yeah, there's definitely been quite a lot of adaptations of books that I just never watched, especially when I read the reviews and the reviews are average. So the emotional impact is not going to be different for me if the adaptation is good or not. Like, I'll still love the books just as much, even if there's a good adaptation or a bad adaptation. So yeah, I kind of agree with both of you here. People should dog ear pages more.
I mean, if they want to and it's their book, I guess it doesn't really matter. But for me, I am hard to disagree with dog earing pages for myself anyway.
Yeah.
That's true. My wife, she always dog ears like pages that she reads, and I just look at her and I'm like, what are you doing? Like, you're destroying that book. Here's a bookmark. I have like 50.
Right.
But it's nice though, because whenever she reads my books, like, she's really careful with the spine. She never dog ears the pages. But if she's bought like a book, she'll just, in my mind, almost destroy that book, and she doesn't care.
I disagree as a general rule, but I also am not one of those people that's going to, if it's their book, they can do whatever. And some people, it's kind of like the idea that you enjoy food that you eat with your hands more. Like, I know for some people it's a really like tactile experience, and it's they want to mark it up and highlight and dog ear pages. And hey, if you're enjoying your book, go for it.
Absolutely. And some people, they, for example, love having a shelf filled with paperback books where all the spines are broken, because that's a sign that they've actually read and enjoyed, those books that have broken spines. So I kind of can see the appeal of having a beat up book, because it's evident that at least you read that book,
It's like different expressions of love. Some people express love with their books by keeping them in pristine condition and having them displayed on the shelf, getting fancy editions. Other people show their love of books by dog earing and writing all over them and showing them being very worn out.
Yeah.
So it just depends on the reader.
Authors should stop using explicit language in modern books. Tolkien managed to. It's kind of similar to one we've already covered, and I would say disagree. My biggest ick is when, again, I wouldn't even call it a big ick, but occasionally I read books that are set in a fantasy world that is inspired by 1500 Asia, and they use swear words we use in 2024. And that
Yep.
kind of breaks my immersion a bit, because I'm like, that makes no sense. But again, it is fantasy, so the author can allow that to happen. So in that sense, I kind of agree. But similar to violence, explicit language can serve its purpose, you know? If there's a person that is wild and just hates everything, it wouldn't really make much sense for that person not to also use explicit language.
I agree with your take, Johan. I think that it can work at times, but sometimes it does break people's immersion. And sometimes it's just too modern and it doesn't make sense. That has happened to me on occasion, but I think it can be done. It's very much it depends situation.
I agree. And I think for me, similar to you guys, like whenever, especially because I read a lot of ancient setting fantasy, if you put modern explicit language in an ancient world, it's an immediate suspension of belief break for me, because I'm like, really? Like these people sound like they're in the 21st century and they're, you know, and it's not just with explicit language. Sometimes it's just modern language in general.
Yeah, and I had a really good experience recently reading To Ride Hell's Chasm by Jenny Wirtz. I know at least Johanna has read it. Have you read it as well?
I have
Tori?
too, yeah.
And that was the first time I've ever read a book where I struggled with the prose, but I really felt the writing style added so much to the world, because genuinely it felt like the characters were speaking like people I would expect in a setting like that. So yeah, even though it's not a book I would recommend to a lot of people, because I do find it's quite hard to recommend because of the prose, that
I agree with
layer
that.
of like writing style, it just added so much to the book.
I completely agree with you. Yes, that was a book that also it took me some time to get into because of the prose, but I do feel that Jenny Wirtz's writing style does work so well with the world she's creating. It's like the prose matches the world building.
And if there's one series on top of my head where I still love that series, but the Poppy War, the F word is used so often, and I'm just like, it doesn't really make much sense. Like why do all the characters use this word? Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Tori and Johanna, for joining me on another episode of Unpopular Opinions. Please, everyone, go and check out their channels. They're absolutely amazing. And yeah, until next time. Goodbye. Oh, you're still here and you want more? Well, the good news is that if you want more and you want to support me, then I do have a Patreon. Now, if you didn't know, then I have a Viking book club where every single month we read one book together, and you can be the one that can put the book forward. Last month we read this book, and this month we're reading this book. And at the moment we are trialing having Zoom book club discussions after everyone has read the book. So also, if you want to discuss a book with me and other like-minded people, then the Patreon is the way to go. Now, in addition to getting your name in my videos, joining the Viking book club, potentially getting art cards depending on what tier you are, I am also basically spending around 100% of my Patreon income to reinvest back into my channel. Since I launched my Patreon, I have had more than 30 videos professionally edited. And just to give you an example, from September 2023 to March 2024, I have spent more than $1,500 into video editing with the aim to consistently post high quality videos for you to enjoy. It is much appreciated.